if you can go first, you can introduce yourself and start your presentation now, please, Anton.
Sure. I'm hoping you can see my screen, perhaps if my fellow panelists can.
Yes, we can see your screen very clearly.
And you can see my presentation is the only thing on my screen, I hope, not everything else. Okay, good. Well, good day to everyone tuning in and to my fellow panelists. I want to reflect on one of the lessons that was hammered home to us during the very tough 3-year drought in Cape Town, which was 2016 to 2018. And that was that while we were running around encouraging everyone to use less water, trying to fix taps, leaking taps and pipes, drilling wells for groundwater, and ultimately building desalination plants in an attempt to avoid what became known locally as Day Zero, that ominous day in which the taps ran dry because of the drought. While we were doing that, and most of these were very important things to be doing, let me add that, perhaps with the exception of desalination. I think the jury's still out on that one. But while we were busy doing all of those important things, we somehow missed a trick by not focusing on where the water that was arriving in Cape Town, and I just need to get to my next slide. But the water that was arriving in Cape Town, which is marked with a star on this map, not focusing on actually where that water comes from. And that is the water catchments located some 100 kilometers outside of Cape Town. And it's those catchments which I think we have learned in a very acute way are actually the foundation of the city's water security. More specifically, it's the catchments in the bottom right-hand corner of this of my slide, the strategic catchments upstream of the major dams, which we had somehow neglected in quite important ways. And one of the very specific ways was to ignore the quite rapid spread of fast-growing, invasive, in fact, foreign plants, which accounted for, depending on which catchment you were in, sub-catchment that is, between 3% and 12% of the water arriving in the city of Cape Town. Now that might sound like quite small margins of water to you, but then bear in mind that Cape Town itself was playing in a very, very tight space where we only had a couple of percentage points of water left available to the city before we ran out of water. What's more, and we've discovered this subsequently, is that by removing the water, removing those alien invasive plants, what would become known as alien invasive species, we would have released water into the dams that feed Cape Town at a cost of between $10 cents and perhaps $2 per cubic meter. Now that might not mean a whole lot to you, but it's an order of magnitude less than the next best option, which is the fixing of leaks and the pumping of groundwater. And it's 2 orders of magnitude cheaper than the price that Cape Town eventually ended up paying for the desalination of water. And so somehow by focusing on our immediate issues, end of pipe, end of tap solutions, we ignored this bedrock of water security. And by the way, I found this argument around the need to think beyond end users and beyond urban demand to apply to the city of Accra in Ghana, where I've been working for the last 3 years. And in a slightly different way, sorry, my screen's in a slightly different way. I don't have control of my screen, so I'm going to keep talking to it. But in a slightly different way, it applies to the city of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where the mining of charcoal outside of the city of Dar es Salaam massively exacerbates the incidence of flooding in Dar es Salaam. And so there's this general sense that in order to solve particularly urban water crises, which are a growing phenomenon around the world, we need to look outside of cities and pay attention to water catchments. Once the importance of water catchments for water security is recognized, you face the very difficult challenge of how to invest in these catchments. And this is the focus of some work that I'm busy with at the moment with the World Wildlife Fund here in South Africa, work that's funded by the Global Environment Facility. And in that work, we focus on three options for investing in water catchments. The first is, and these options will differ from context to context. So this work is in the very particular context of South Africa and South Africa's water policy. But in different countries, it'll apply to different extents. And what we find is that there's definite potential to increase the price of water on some users. I think one needs to be very clear on this, that not every farmer or every forester is able to afford more expensive water, but almost universally around the world, people's water supply is being subsidized because they are not paying for the full cost of that water, and they're certainly not paying for the catchment stewardship, which underpins the security of supply of that water.
Anton, you've got 2 minutes more.
Sure. The second option is really around banks and insurance companies, and this involves helping water users make the transition, particularly the transition once water prices have increased, to become more water efficient. And there's a whole raft of financial products which is necessary and must come on stream in order to enable more water efficient economies. And the third option, which is an option that we focused on a lot in this study, is actually probably the biggest option, and that is to start seeing the natural capital, and that natural capital includes water catchments, as part of the infrastructure that delivers goods and services to cities around the world. And where you get that shift in perspective, you create the potential to spend infrastructure money, both infrastructure money being used to build dams and water transfer schemes, but also infrastructure money in its own right, to use that money in investing in the natural capital that ultimately underpins our water security. This is something that we've been focusing on in the South African context. And of course, it would free up large budgets, infrastructure budgets, that you'd be able to spend on this natural capital stewardship. And a critical gap, and I'll leave the conversation here, a critical gap, which is outlined in this final slide around this, is if you're going to do this, you enter the terrain of what is now sort of common parlance, which is blended finance, because ultimately you're going to be using some public funds, some institutional money in pension funds, possibly some bank finance and other grants. And so it's likely to end up being a blended finance investment in ecological capital. But there's a critical gap which we see across contexts, which is the institutional capacity to blend the outcomes, which will then enable you to blend the finance. And those outcomes are both more water and more water security, less money that's spent on bulk infrastructure, so delayed capital investment in the next dam or the next desalination plant, and delayed investment in water cleaning because you have a healthy environment which is doing some of that water scrubbing for you. And different people are going to benefit to different degrees from those different bits of the blended outcome that you're aiming for. And we see a particular gap in the institutions that are capable of convening the conversations around those complex outcomes, which will then enable the blending of finance into this very important issue, which I try to speak to, which is the ecological systems which underpin water security and urban water security in particular. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you very much. And thank you for staying within the time limits. Belinda, you're next, are you?
I am, Ravi, thank you. So good afternoon, colleagues, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us today. I just want to pick up from a couple of Anton's points around, I think he's spoken actually really nicely about the issue of valuing water and how to increase access to finance, blended or otherwise, around this. But before I start, I'm Belinda Petrie from One World Sustainable Investments, and I'll be talking a little bit more about just the title of our seminar in terms of some keywords. We are looking through the seminar at COVID, climate resilience and water. So trying to bring those lenses together. And some of the key words for my brief discussion this afternoon will be around disruption and innovation, organization. Again, this theme of valuing water, and here I'll focus on valuing the informal economy and how to build back better, and some ideas around that. So firstly, just to say that disruptive innovation is critical in times like we're having at the moment. It's critical in terms of resolving and building resilience to climate change. I was going to say in resolving the climate change problem. But it's critical in terms of building resilience, and it's particularly critical at the moment for emerging informal economies. And I say emerging because COVID in countries all over the world, particularly in developing economies, but I think this is universal, is that the more people lose jobs, the more they get pushed into the informal economy situation. The informal economy being the set of economic, diversified economic activities, enterprises, jobs, workers, etc., that are not regulated or protected by the state. So also just thinking very consciously about how we do that in the context of a previous World Water Week theme, which was about leaving no one behind. But to do this, organization of people and solutions is critical. So if we want to mobilize the informal economy, it needs to be organized. And we've seen many examples of this around the world. Waste pickers, for example, in South Africa, very difficult section of the informal economy to mobilize, has actually effectively been mobilized in parts of the country. So there are some very good examples. The point being that the disruptive innovation is critical for in terms of decentralized solutions. So that's part of the disruptive innovation for resource management and for access to key resources. So disruptive innovation is really about decentralized solutions plus informal economies and the inclusive digital economy, which I'll come back to. And I've just given a couple of examples as to why disruptive innovation in the form of decentralized solutions is critical, not least of which is because of climate events, extreme climatic events. So this particular example is from Grenada in the Caribbean, where their very centralized water resource management systems got wiped out in the series of cyclones and hurricanes that hit the islands. I was there, I saw the devastation, and it takes months, sometimes more than a year to build those solutions back. So what they did in Grenada was embark on a series of innovative solutions for water resource management in response to the impact of extreme events. So you can see a water reservoir here. This particular slide is about water storage tanks and a desalination plant in another part of the Caribbean. But the reality, colleagues, is that the cost of centralized water solutions are prohibitive, and the effectiveness can be low or zero in the face of a climate disaster. So when a climate disaster hits and it hits the centralized system, that whole system is out. So emerging economies, as we've seen in Grenada, can develop and manage off-grid and localized systems. And agreed with Anton, this is, you're looking at hard infrastructure. There is a very strong relationship between these decentralized systems and the soft or ecosystem-based infrastructure, the green infrastructure. But this can happen, and it can happen from scratch. And we have seen some very good examples of this. From a digitization perspective, I mentioned earlier that these systems can be dynamic and data-driven rather than mechanistic to help integrate and optimize all kinds of smart technologies, sensors, etc., with different devices being able to talk to a customer's iPhone and to send real-time information for real-time data and analysis via the cloud. The thing about that is that it does require that informal economies have got access to the internet. And so one of the key questions we're asking at the moment is, how do we accelerate a situation of change? So this is a very crude graph that I just put together conceptually for today's presentation. But if we can look at the velocity of change over time, is how do we move away from historically linear trajectories in terms of building the resilience of systems and people to reach a sort of change, an exponential rate of change. One of the ways that this can be done is through constructive, disruptive innovation. And then you can get that exponential curve that you see on the green line. And the interesting thing, and I mean, it's devastating, but we do all hope that something good comes out of the coronavirus situation that we're in, is that it does give a sense of urgency to a situation around climate resilience that we've been looking at for a long time. It does bring a sense of urgency. So one of the key questions is, how do we use disruptive innovation in different ways to accelerate the curve and get that exponential rate of change that we haven't been getting in the past. And all of this is with a view to being able to build back better. So a question that I have, I mean, Ravi will ask questions to the panel, but a key question I have for this group that's with us today, our audience and my fellow panelists, is how we can use the situation we're in at the moment. We know about the climate crisis, as it's increasingly called, to prepare better, to pivot from where we are, to be able to build back better and faster, because time is definitely no longer on our side. So this does necessitate, as I said earlier, access to energy and the internet. So a digital water economy, being able to value water better through digital access, for example, but also to be able to build a more resilient society relies heavily on access to the digital economy. And this has never been so stark as it is now, that those who haven't been able to access the digital economy have got less opportunities to work, less opportunities to be educated, less opportunity to access resources and manage those. So scaled up investments are needed in all developing regions. Africa is very much behind the curve. I did some research on this recently. And this is in critical means for protecting and uplifting the informal sector. So I'm going to leave my part of the conversation with this thought of how do we pivot, build back better and faster. I know that I'm talking mainly to water professionals, and I'm hoping that this stimulates some thinking outside of your water box. That we're all in this together, and building resilience is critical to building a better water future that's high value for all in an inclusive way. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you very much, Belinda. So Monica, do you have a quick presentation?
Yes, well, I won't use a presentation, but I will just share. Do you hear me well?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Now I will share with you, I mean, the lessons we have learned, and whether this crisis, is giving us an opportunity to drive systemic change based on a project we do for the government of the Netherlands in Peru, the Valuing Water journey. Maybe you're familiar or not, but the Valuing Water initiative comes from it's an initiative of the UN high-level panel on water, in which the idea and the intention is to drive systemic change, to make each drop of water count, right? And to do that, though, I think it's like Anton was saying, we first need to understand the whole water cycle and the dynamics of that water cycle with the economic dynamics, then value it accordingly and manage it. I mean, these principles that we try to now make concrete in how public and private investment decisions are done in different countries, basically are trying to recognize not only the multiple values of water, but also, of course, trying to look at how to also protect the sources, no? Now, what we see is like, I mean, and it has been a bit of a surprise to everyone, for instance, if we see at a country like Peru, who had a good policy and governance for the management of water, at least doing the intention to have the same over a number of governments. but also economically was looking very good and was the first country in Latin America to lock down. Still, the impacts or the results they have achieved are very poor. It's one of the most affected now in terms of COVID-19. And there are three lessons that have been drawn by them, and is that informality has been one of the main reasons that explain how their measures were not successful. No? The other is, of course, inequality and the lack of investment the last years in a good health system. Now, saying that, what we see and what I think I like that to share is that in a way, and it's the same in the Netherlands, that it was just after the last terrible flood that people got aware and committed to invest in flood protection, is that I think the COVID-19 is really creating this window of opportunity, because there is a lot of awareness that a rethinking and a reset of their economic model needs to happen. And we see a lot of those agendas that were taking too long to advance now accelerating, no? So what we have done is that we have actually reshaped our project from being focused on a particular basin, because our counterpart can't cope at this moment with this situation. There cannot be travels to those areas, to try to build this multi-sectoral coalition, no? And a space, I think a safe space where you can recognize what went wrong, and that there is also space for transformative relationships between people to drive this change. Because I think often we look at policies, we look at I mean, a lot of somehow abstract terms, but at the end, by the end of the day, is people who has the will and is connected to other people who has the will, who will drive this process of systemic change. So what we see now, and we're trying to get into that, is that COVID-19 has been a really important stress test to the resilience of this economy. And then also you can draw different lessons about which institutions have worked and not, whether they are formal or informal. It almost doesn't matter, as long as they have driven this behavioral change. And there is a big opportunity. I mean, it's the country who is also putting the largest recovery plan, around $18 billion, and already had a reconstruction plan after the last flood. So I think what we see basically is that, and we hope that with this COVID-19, we all recognize that inclusion is almost, I mean, it's a pillar for resilience, right? If we keep our societies built on just a very tiny high class or middle class having the voice, basically we're not going to be able to cope with these collective challenges. But also that, as Belinda was also referring, is, you know, although this is called the Valuing Water Initiative, is at the end of the day is, do we value everyone the same and their access to water, to internet? So do we really care about this divide between the richest and the poorest and most vulnerable? That's about what I wanted to share. So I think it's really an opportunity, and I hope in the discussion now we can come with some ways to speed it up.
Thank you very much, Monica. So we've got 3 rich presentations on different aspects of resilience: financial resilience, behavioral resilience, systemic resilience. But let me ask Arun, who hasn't had a chance to present, a question. Arun, are there something about specific geographical areas? I know you are working on mountain areas, and Peru also there are mountain areas. But are there specific geographical issues and regions that call for particular approaches to building resilience?
Yeah, thanks, Ravi. Can you hear me okay?
Very clearly.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Arun Shrestha. I work for International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. And yes, to answer your question, Ravi, definitely I think, you know, remote, decentralized locations have their own context. And I'm going to, present a little bit, talk a little bit about, the Hindu Kush Himalayas context, the mountain complex of South Asia, where we work. The Hindu Kush Himalaya, you might probably know, is characterized by remoteness, limited communication, and connectivity. And therefore, the issue of water availability and supply has a completely different meaning here, which needs to be noted when we are talking about, resilience, capacitating resilience, right? It deserves a different kinds of look. Why? Because in the Hindu Kush Himalaya and probably in other typical mountainous regions also, water supply systems are heavily reliant on natural ecosystems such as stream, groundwater, springs, ponds, wetland, etc., and less on engineered solutions, for example, storages of large kinds and conveyance system. Of course, in this region also, in this Kush Himalaya region, there are a lot of dams and other kind of structure being built, but these are mostly for the supply of urban centers, not the rural centers. What I'm talking about is about the rural area. But those rural areas are also facing difficulties in terms of water scarcity and also water-related hazards. They are already facing gaps in terms of supply and demand because of various reasons, biophysical changes, including climate, but also socioeconomic dynamics, right? So that is there. So what I would like to say in response to your question, Ravi, that yes, because of the context, I think the resilient solution in this type of, geographic, including in Hindu Kush Himalaya, have to be looked at from a different angle, and they have to be more nature-based and people-centric solutions. And if you allow, let me talk about one or two examples which we have, successfully implemented for the benefit of the audience. Spring is a very important resource, although we have glaciers and snowmelt, but spring is quite important resource for water supply. And because they are depleting, we have developed 6-step methodology for spring revival, which is being practiced in different countries, Bhutan, Nepal, and India, which is a good, actually solution. We have also tried to work on different, decentralized solutions for helping local level agricultural water management. For example, a mountain relevant solar irrigation system, hydro ram pumps, etc., which beside technology has a very strong community-led governance system, which is very important, right? It's not just the technology, but the governance. Grounded in the communities. And then we are working on local level incentives for ecosystem services. These are completely different from the large scale ecosystem incentives. And then we should not forget the, too much water aspect, the floods. So another example is community-based flood early warning system. Again, besides technology, it is a very strong community component, which has shown to be very good in terms of flood resilience. So what I can say that, of course, the context is very important. And for this kind of, geographics, the nature-based solutions, community-led solutions are very important. We have good number of solutions available which needs to be scaled up through policy interventions and outscaling. Of course, there are opportunities to learn from others. And I think, building resilience to climate, as well as resilience to COVID, I think we have to enforce more and more these kind of grounded local level solutions. So I would just like to stop here and go with the discussion. Thank you so much.
Let me ask a general question that's arising from Anton's and Belinda's presentations. Anton, you talked about the fact that back end is important. You said that people tend to concentrate at the retail end, the tap end, whereas the resource is often neglected because it's kind of out of sight or far away. Isn't that in opposition to the fact that decentralized solutions that Belinda is talking about are mostly to do with, isn't that a centralized approach, a centralized water resource feeding to a lot of decentralized systems? Isn't there a sort of a contradiction, or is it perfectly harmonious? So both Belinda and Anton. I hope it's not a trick question. It's an honest question.
Actually, Ravi, I think it's a very interesting question because certainly in the domain that I know reasonably well, which is African cities, you see both happening. You see still an important role played by utilities, old, long-standing, often only servicing a portion of society, and trying to balance very difficult kind of precarious fiscal positions of who they extend services to. And then in the vacuum left behind by the state very often, you see the types of innovations which are now tech-enabled that Belinda was referring to. And so you do have this, I think you're right to put your finger on it, because it is a tension between a centralized system which comes from a school of governance, which is these are public goods, and they're much too complicated for any private company or any single widget to sort out on its own. And so the government must take responsibility for them, with the problems that come along with that centralized approach, in contrast to the highly atomized, household scale, bottom-up, often grassroots and community-based innovations which are emerging in the absence of the state. And I don't know how these two things are going to kind of stitch themselves together. I think it could be quite contested. But I do think that the challenge is to take the best of both systems, whilst not ignoring, obviously, the thing, as you point out, which is out of sight and out of mind. And if you're not careful, nobody takes care of, neither the states nor the households or the end users, which is the ecosystem. So it's about finding a hybrid, which is governance and tech meshed, that works for a particular context. And I don't think I've seen that anywhere, to be honest. So that's
so the golden mean is elusive everywhere. Belinda, do you have a response?
I should say that I don't think it's one or the other. I think this, I mean, it's a big thing to say, but I think it's a public-private partnership approach, and I don't mean a PPP around a utility. I mean, this is something that we need, water resources and others, to be managed both by communities and by governments. And we need that kind of partnership approach. So I don't know if it's a hybrid, as Anton puts it, or, if it's a real partnership, but, you need government for certain aspects of the system, right? You need government for regulations and for regulating pricing, for example, if that's the way we still want to go. But you also need, empowered communities to take more responsibility for their own use and often their own systems that government can't provide. So, and there needs to be the paving of the way for that. I think one of the greatest difficulties is something that Anton touched on, and that is that, traditional governance systems treat something like water as this public good that they must control everything of, and it's a paradigm shift that's going to be needed to shift a little bit away from that. But you definitely don't want things falling through the cracks either, which I think is why this is an important question. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Monica, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the importance of partnerships, right? And you said people need to work together. So that raises an important thing. We don't talk enough about SDG 17, which is all about collaboration. We only talk about SDG 6 and so. But in your view, a partnership has to be led by somebody. Do you think the governments have a bigger role, communities, NGOs? Who do you think should take the lead in developing these partnerships and systems, collaborative systems?
Yeah, thank you, Ravi. Well, I think there is always also the two answers. So, I mean, ideally, I think, as Belinda also said, the governments should set up a, basic enabling environment, for instance, for private sector participation, but also for community participation. At the same time, I mean, there are many places in Latin America, for instance, but I think in many developing countries where governments are almost absent, right? So they have no capacity to reach those places. So I think we have to accept that reality and work almost as per watershed to see who is the most able at that specific moment to take the leadership, right? But at the same time, we really try. We should try to get the governments to take the first steps. And I think also that it's a matter of, what I would really argue is that we have to look at the issue from an incentives point of view, right? Because we have, and we see with COVID-19, a lot of formal institutions at the end have had no role on controlling the process, and informal institutions, like, which is the case also in many communities in mountains, which were more like traditions, or, I mean, culturally bounded institutions that do not exist in paper, had a very vital role in controlling this. So I think when we're thinking on a strategy, we have to acknowledge there are already institutions there which may not be formally recognized, and we need to also use that potential. So it's really like PPP and more like people, private and public, right? And the one most able in that specific setting should be encouraged to take the lead.
Okay, so here's the thing. You know, when we make these statements and present this analysis, we have at the back of our mind some sort of a system, right? It could be middle income countries have a certain system, lower income countries have no system or poor systems, etc., etc. So when we present solutions, this is to every member of the panel. Do we recognize that things are so different and could be very dysfunctional in certain areas? And the solutions that we suggest, are they only confined to a few fortunate few? Or is it general in the sense of leaving no one behind? So Anton, Belinda, Monica, and Arun, you all have a crack at this one.
Well, I'm happy to kick it off, Ravi. Thank you. I think all of the solutions, any of us, but I won't speak for my fellow panelists, that we're raising to be inclusive. So the intention is not to benefit a few. And some of the solutions I spoke of earlier, I have seen in very poor countries and working, but I've equally seen, you know, complete dysfunctionality in other such countries. So for me, the issue doesn't lie in the solution, it lies in the implementation. And how that's driven. So, and the issue for me around the digital economy is that countries in Africa are prohibitively expensive, for example, around creating that access. And I think that is limiting all kinds of resilience building, you know, access to natural resources, access to education, access to employment, etc., because of these prohibitive costs. And so that's the way that these things are being implemented, because we also know that in other parts of the world, like India, where you are, that access is much greater. And you're also, you know, a poor country. So why is it that it's different? So for me, the question here lies not around the actual solution, but it's around how it's implemented, the political will behind it. Monica said earlier, you know, governments have to start things. There has to be that drive and the policy drive and some investment will to go with that to make it happen. And the solutions obviously also need to be customized to key areas. But I think the question boils down to how badly do the different countries, governments and areas want to build back better, and how invested are they in making that happen? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Anton, do you have a view on this, about this?
Yeah, absolutely. Unsurprisingly, I guess I do. I mean, of course, context matters, Ravi, and I think the solutions that will emerge, we hope, must be context specific. But I suppose my general point is that the default, up until now, the default has been to discount the public goods, right? That's the public goods of the ecosystems which support water security. It's the public goods of universal access and inclusivity, because I think of that as a public good. And that as we've seen finance mobilize for the water sector, we've seen a tendency towards this default of financing the visible, the commodification of water, and forgetting about where our water comes from, which is the catchments. And so, you know, perhaps at this moment, as Monica was saying, where we've actually seen governments around the world clamoring to protect the public good of public health institutions in the face of a pandemic, perhaps you can take a little bit of that thinking and say, well, what are the other public goods? And in this, for the purpose of my presentation, the focus is on healthy water catchments, but what are the other public goods with which we really, really don't want to be without in the face of a crisis? And how do we invest in those? I mean, I think the first thing is recognizing the need for the public goods. The more difficult thing, which is I try to put my finger on, is how you mobilize investment into those public goods. And I think the Grow Back Better narrative offers the opportunity. In fact, one of the things that we've been talking about a lot here is how you can get people working in catchment stewardship, i.e. outdoors, close to where they live, in a healthy environment, and it's low-skilled work, and produce the, so that's a great thing to do in the context of a post-COVID recovery, and create the co-benefit of heightened water security. So I think those are the opportunities we should be looking for.
Monica, thank you very much, Anton. Monica, I'm going to put it slightly more in a more specific way. To what degree have sectors or industries taken on the opportunity for systemic change during the pandemic? You know, have they lived up to the rhetoric, or have they taken on a leadership role? Have they, or they're hidden behind?
Coincidentally, earlier today, I was also hearing how public utilities started to look after the well-being of their clients. You know, so I think in a way, because of the emergency, people start to consider their employees, their clients in a much kind of wider perspective than the normal role. So in that sense, you do see that there were quite some institutions who lived up to, you know, like who had good leadership and went beyond. Now, there is a risk though, and that's what we're also going to look at, that some of the ways that the crisis was dealt with can also though undermine or give you again a very narrow shift, right? Because like, for instance, if we look just on water sanitation, what indeed is like so important to washing your hands, you may end up though not giving enough attention to water resources management. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why we want to see, we need to create those spaces of conversation to, even though we need to take action very quickly, try to embrace the complexity that is needed, no? For making it local, specific, and effective.
So Arun, you know, we're talking about trade-offs here. You know, what Monica was referring to, a trade-off between the big centralized stuff and the small local stuff. Do you have any view, for instance, in the mountain regions, should we look at the big picture or should we look at a village at a time? I mean, that's a caricature, slightly a caricature, but you know what I'm getting at. Should we look at the big picture, or do we start with the small local solutions first?
I think, Ravi, it's not a question of either or. I think they have to go hand in hand. You know, like, for example, I work in a framework of river basin, right? So being a water person, I work in river basin. So basin is my geographic entity. But when you look at river basin, one can start with the big Ganges, Brahmaputra, Indus kind of basin. But then if you go deeper into it, you go into sub-basins and catchments, right? And then if you look at administration, these are multiple countries. And then these are nations and sub-national entities and local entities. What is the reality is there is a strong interconnection between from the small to the biggest one up to the international level. Somehow we try to forget it and try to either look at very local solutions, very local challenges and local solutions, or we look at basin scale interventions, you know, big dams diverting water from certain catchment to another catchment and electricity supply. I think that has been the problem. So what I think is have that interlinkages, the multi-scale approach. That's what we are calling it, multi-scale approach that actually connects the issue, challenges, and solution at local level to medium-sized level and the larger scale. So I think that is what should be the ideal situation. Is it happening? I don't think so. Ideally, it is not, but I think that is the way I think it has to go. Otherwise, it won't work.
Thank you, Arun. So we've come to the end of 45 minutes. 45 minutes is really nothing. It's a dot in time compared to the big issues we're talking about. But what we seem to have ended on is, it's not either or, it's not a binary situation, it's and rather or and or. So let's remember that. And with that, like to please join me in thanking all the panelists and the speakers and the presenters for the valuable insights. This is a very, very complex issue. And I'm sorry I've not been able to take questions from the audience, but the clock's defeating us. And so there's nothing one can do about that. Time is relentless. So thank you all very much. And a very good evening to all of you. Thank you very, very, very much. Rebecca, do you want to have a last word?
No, thank you, Ravi.